Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 348. In this episode, we're continuing our journey through the Fall of Númenor by exploring the chapter circa 1600, Sauron Forges the One Ring. Before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Stick 'em up, fellowship. 3, 2, 1, whoopsht. Boom. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Melkor27, and KG. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in September or October of 2023. I have to say a quick note on this before I list off those names. I got the September names wrong last time. Those were actually our August names. Thank you to all of our patrons, but I was just behind in updating my list. So this is our September and October. September, I'm going to keep you on this list through the next couple of episodes just to pay you the tribute you deserve. So that list for September and or October of 2023 is Catherine, Tom S., Cherie R., Stephanie B., John W., Alan C., Dustin Q., Robert S., Melkor27, Eugene D., James L., Ken P., Samuel B., Redhawk, and Alex S. Thank you so much for sticking with us over the years. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and land you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. If you're watching, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. Finally, attention binge listeners, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. All right, let's dive on into this chapter of the Fall of Númenor. The full title of this chapter is a mouthful. Circa 1600, Sauron forges the One Ring in Orodruin. He completes the Barad-dûr, and Celebrimbor perceives the designs of Sauron. So this chapter is really where we start to get to Sauron unveiling his scheme, and things are about to get very real in Middle-earth. The original sources for this chapter are primarily Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's Letters, Unfinished Tales, the Silmarillion, and the Nature of Middle-earth. Okay, and at this time in the history of the Second Age, we still have Tar Telperion, the second ruling queen of Númenor, as the ruler of Númenor. She has been the queen of Númenor for the last few chapters, but with good reason. During her reign, many momentous events unfold in Númenor, so it all kind of makes sense. All right, well, this chapter begins dealing with really the power of Sauron's One Ring, the One Ring. Sauron taught the elves the techne of the rings, but his greatest secret was that he would be able to control them with a greater version of the same tech. So we could liken this to many things, and I've talked about what the One Ring was and how the whole ring scheme really worked. I've reflected on that many times in this podcast. It's something that's really kind of a fascinating idea to me, and it really gets to the heart of this idea of, like, you wouldn't think of the rings as being technology, because we think of technology in our modern sense of being like, gadgets that do amazing things, but how different is that really? I mean, because the rings that Sauron taught the elves to create and then created his own ring to rule those rings, I mean, there's some kind of magic going on, and how often is the technology that we use magic to us, right? And I think in Tolkien's mind, those two concepts were very closely related. Tolkien did not look upon the idea of magic as this like neato thing. He was very skeptical of magic, and he likened it to modern technology, right? To the things that make the will more quickly effective, with the idea that in the wrong hands, and probably most of us are the wrong hands, these tools can be very dangerous, very dangerous. But the key power of the One Ring was that through it, Sauron could see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore the lesser rings. Thus, the ruling ring, as it is sometimes called, or the master ring in some cases as well. So it also says that Sauron put a great part of himself into the creation of this ring. So let's read a little bit about what Tolkien has to say about that. And this passage actually comes from the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. This is from the famous Waldman letter. And Tolkien in this letter says, "But to achieve this, he had been obliged to let a part of his own inherent power, a frequent and very significant motive in myth and fairy story, pass into the One Ring. When he wore it, his power on earth was actually enhanced. But even if he did not wear it, that power existed and was in rapport with himself. He was not diminished. Unless some other seized it and became possessed of it. If that happened, the new possessor could, if sufficiently strong and heroic by nature, challenge Sauron, become master of all that he had learned or done since the making of the One Ring, and so overthrow him and usurp his place. This was the essential weakness he had introduced into his situation in his effort, largely unsuccessful, to enslave the elves, and in his desire to establish a control over the minds and wills of his servants. There was another weakness. If the One Ring was actually unmade, annihilated, then its power would be dissolved, Sauron's own being would be diminished to vanishing point, and he would be reduced to a shadow, a mere memory of malicious will. But that he never contemplated nor feared. The ring was unbreakable by any smithcraft less than his own. It was indissoluble in any fire, save the undying subterranean fire where it was made, and that was unapproachable in Mordor. And so great was the ring's power of lust that anyone who used it became mastered by it. It was beyond the strength of any will, even his own, to injure it, cast it away, or neglect it. So he thought. It was, in any case, on his finger. So we get kind of a rundown from Tolkien's perspective of, the various powers of the ring. The idea that Sauron put a lot of himself into this ring, kind of a lot of his inherent nature. We see a similar idea in the Silmarillion with Morgoth's diminishing stature as he puts, or diminishing powers as he puts a lot of himself into the creation of his armies, right? The creation of his forces, the doing of his evil works. So much so that if you've ever wondered why that, I think it's volume 10 or 11 of the history of Middle-earth is called Morgoth's Ring, it's because in Tolkien's mind, all of Middle-earth was, in a way, Morgoth's ring, right? Just like Sauron's ring is the ring he puts a lot of himself into. Well, Morgoth's ring is all of Middle-earth because he puts a lot of himself into it in order to rule it, right? Because he wants to rule it. So that's where that title, Morgoth's ring, really comes from, is that similar idea here. But really, so Sauron, as long as he has this ring, is not diminished because he has it in his possession. And we might see that as different with Morgoth because he never really rules Middle-earth in that way. He puts a lot of himself into the ruling of it, but never quite rules it as he would like. And so he does not possess it in the fullness of the way he'd like. But as long as Sauron possesses this ring, he's extremely powerful, right? He's kind of got his full stature. So then why create the ring? Why put your power into this? Well, because it's that doorway into the other rings, the lesser rings. Through that doorway, through kind of that back door, right? You think of like the like software developers and that kind of thing. You ever heard this concept, right? They create, some of them might create a back door. In the movie War Games, they really explore this whole idea. It's like, when we were creating the software, for this war machine, war computer, I created this back door into it that only I knew about, so that I could go in programmatically and kind of do whatever I wanted to do. And I think a lot of programmers have done this over history. They've given themselves kind of this back door. But even you think like, the people who control the networks, right? You think of, somebody who has that admin access, right? Just think of it on that level, admin access, right? The super admin, right? Whoever has that super admin access, in theory, they can access anything, right? They can access anything. And the only thing holding them back from doing that is the threat of the law, right? It's it's really, well, and hopefully just good morals, but it's really that threat of the law. There's so much power concentrated there in their hands, and as long as they have that password, that admin access into the overriding access, then they can manipulate and do things as they will. So it's a very powerful weapon in that way, because whenever these other trusting elves who think that Sauron is actually trying to help them, whenever they put these rings on, boom, Sauron can know their thoughts. However, it says the elves were not so lightly to be caught. They immediately perceive Sauron's intentions and take off their rings. And Celebrimbor, who of course was the leader of these elf smiths that created the lesser rings, Celebrimbor goes to Lorrenand, which we discussed in the last episode. This is what will become known as Lothlorien to us later on. This is the realm of Galadriel, east of the Misty Mountains. And Galadriel counsels Celebrimbor that the three rings should be put away. She accepts Nenya, the ring of water, which serves to both beautify and strengthen Lorrenand, but also to increase her latent desire for the sea and diminish her joy in Middle-earth. And the other two elvish rings are sent to Gil-galad and Lindan, far away from Sauron's reach. Yes, these rings go elsewhere, and we'll talk about what happens with those rings in later episodes. But Galadriel has Nenya, the ring of water, and it has this twofold effect of both strengthening and beautifying Lorrenand, but also causing her to long for the sea and to long for the uttermost west, right? To return to that place, which is why we kind of see within her this there's always this tinge of sadness within her, right? As with most of the elves who remain behind in Middle Earth and who once knew the West. Okay, we also learned that Barad-dûr is completed in this time period, and so Barad-dûr being, of course, the fortress of Sauron that he had begun work on many centuries before in the land of Mordor. So let's read a little bit about that. At this time, after 6 centuries of labor by those creatures held in Sauron's thrall, and aided by the power of the One Ring, the mighty structure of Barad-dûr reached completion, being the mightiest fortress to be built in Middle-earth since the fall of Angband, the iron prison or hell of iron in the depths of the Iron Mountains, that in the First Age had served as the fortress of Melkor. Later in the Third Age, shortly before the breaking of the Fellowship of the Ring, Frodo, sitting on the seat of Searing on Amon Hen and wearing the One Ring, saw a vision of the terrible magnificence of Barad-dûr. His gaze was held, wall upon wall, battlement upon battlement, black, immeasurably strong, mountain of iron, gate of steel, tower of adamant. He saw it. Barad-dûr, fortress of Sauron. All hope left him. So this very intimidating fortress of Sauron is completed in this time. Sauron returns to this place, and he begins planning for his attack upon the west, his unveiling his attack upon the west. So one of the interesting questions that's posed to us in this chapter is why, if the elves finally see Sauron for who he truly is, and they see his malicious intentions, why don't they go ahead and attack, right? Why don't they go ahead and bring war to him? And why do they just kind of sit back and assume that everything's going to be okay? Is that what they're assuming? Well, Tolkien takes this notion head on and has a really interesting response to it. So let's also read Tolkien's response to this idea. Make my text a little bigger here. All right, a little bigger. All right. Close that. It is now vain and indeed unjust to judge them foolish not to do, as in the end they were obliged to do, to have quickly gathered their forces and assailed Sauron. So Tolkien is basically saying it's unjust and it's foolish, right, to judge them at this time for not having done what they later would know they need to do, right, or they should have done, right? And we can kind of see this. It's basically saying like, hey, hindsight's 2020, Monday morning quarterback. This they didn't know, right? They didn't know that it was the right time to launch an attack on Sauron. He goes a little bit further into this. They could not have any certain knowledge of Sauron's intentions or his power, and it was one of the successes of his cunning and deceits that they were unaware of his actual weakness, and his need for a long time in which to gather armies sufficient to assail an alliance of the elves and western men. His occupation of Mordor he no doubt would have kept secret if he could, and would appear from later events that he had secured the allegiance of men that dwelt in lands adjacent, even those west of Anduin, in those regions where afterwards was Gondor and the Ered Nimraias and Kalinarthon. But the Númenóreans occupying the mouths of Anduin and the shorelands of Lebanon had discovered his devices and revealed them to Gil-galad. But until Second Age 1600, he was still using the disguise of beneficent friend, and often journeyed at will in Ariador with few attendants, and so could not risk any rumor that he was gathering armies. At this time he perforce neglected the east, where Morgoth's ancient power had been, and though his emissaries were busy among the multiplying tribes of eastern men, he dared not permit any of them to come within sight of the Númenóreans, or of western men. So an interesting passage there. Tolkien explains to us why, we shouldn't judge the elves too harshly for having not attacked early on. It's weird as I was trying to understand what Tolkien is saying here. I got to admit, it was a little bit hard for me to sort of wrap my mind around it. Tolkien just sometimes he has that kind of wordiness of a writer, where he maybe says things in a more roundabout way than he could have, right? But what I think he's trying to say is actually not that the elves wouldn't have thought him a threat. It's that the elves, for all they knew, they had been played for a fool, and they were dealing with somebody who was very powerful, right? I believe that's what they're saying. When in reality, this would have been the perfect time if they had known better. This would have been the perfect time for them to attack. But all they knew was that he had played them for a fool, and that the Númenóreans had shared with them intelligence that told them that he actually had some forces available, right? That he had been up to these things for a while. So, for all they knew, Sauron was actually quite powerful at this time, and to go with a direct assault upon him might have been the wrong move. That's how I read it. I'm not sure. I mean, if you guys read it differently, let me know. I really tried to kind of parse this and make sure I was understanding it correctly. Regardless, I just don't see the elves as being, this is, we got to remember, this is, even though it's elves we're talking about and they live a long time, they're immortal, like they live a long time. This is still 1600 years after the last time there was really a big open war in Middle-earth. For all they know, this figure, they assume that this figure was a good guy for the last 500 or 600 years, that he was actually there to help them. So I think it's fine for them to say, maybe we just need to let him go, right? Or maybe we need to just tread carefully and start building up our own forces. Maybe we need to start building up our own defenses, because maybe we should be expecting an attack. I don't know. And a lot of times it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's, if I think the history of war maybe teaches us that it's not always the initial aggressor who is the victorious one in the end, right? That sometimes being the initial open war aggressor actually turns out the worst for you in a strategic sense. Simply think of World War II, right? Germany is the first nation to attack in the European theater, and although at first it seems like they're going to win, after a lot of very early major victories, eventually they lose. They lose out utterly, right? And the same thing with the Japanese Empire in World War II, right? They have a lot of victories early on, and then in 1941 attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. Things are looking pretty bad for the U.S., but through a series of events and tactical victories, the U.S. Eventually wins out, right? The U.S. eventually wins out and pretty much destroys the Japanese forces, especially the naval forces. So, in the grand scheme of things, I think this is probably held true. This isn't my expert analysis or anything like that, but it never really ultimately pays to be the initial aggressor in, these kind of large-scale wars like this. Maybe they assumed that Sauron was going to start picking off like kind of little targets here and there, and that would give them, they would be buying time to understand what his forces were up to. I don't think these are all bad, any of these are bad rationales, but it's a very interesting question. I mean, it wouldn't have come to my mind to necessarily blame the elves for waiting and for not necessarily being the initial aggressors. I just don't like the notion in most cases of, I feel like if history has taught us anything, it's don't be the initial aggressor, right? It's like, it's like be smart, be wise. Don't assume that, don't assume that everybody's a good guy when they're projecting that. But be smart in how you present yourself. Always be ready to kind of like to give a strong defense if necessary. But the initial aggressor thing does not usually turn out well, and it usually, even if it does turn out well in some sense, in kind of the strategic or tactical sense, you just end up looking like the bad guy, really, right? You just end up looking like the bad guy. In fact, it would have been an interesting twist if the elves had decided to attack in that way, and Sauron had kind of played the poor, the poor victim, right? He played the poor. Here, I tried to help. I tried to help these elves, and they attack me. What do? They attack me. I could totally see Sauron pulling one of those. It's like what if you study World War II in depth, you'll realize that that's like how the Nazis were always trying to play it. Just so ridiculous. Like they would just be like, oh, we had no choice but to attack because this and that, and they were showing aggression over here. We had no choice, no choice. Even as they're going through and just murdering innocents all over the place. So anyway, I digress. See my video about Tolkien versus the Nazis. Ding. All right. So, that's all about why this delay. We shouldn't judge the elves too harshly. There's an interesting couple of notes here. I wanted to explore this idea that Sauron did not want the men of the East to meet the Númenóreans. I'm going to look at the book, the actual book there. There we go. And read a footnote down here. So it says at the end of this passage that we're looking at, you can see it on the screen here. At this time, he perforce neglected the East, where Morgoth's ancient power had been, and though his emissaries were busy among the multiplying tribes of Eastern men, he dared not permit any of them to come within sight of the Númenóreans or of Western men. So he didn't want the men. I think the point is here he could have gathered a lot of these men early on here and maybe challenge them to come into to help him in war against the West, but he didn't want them coming into contact with the Númenóreans. And let's read a little bit about this from this footnote about why that is. That is, of the numerous tribes of men whom the elves called men of goodwill, who lived in Eriador and Calenarthon, in the vales of Anduin, and in the great wood, and the plains between that and Mordor and the Sea of Rhûn. In Eriador there were actually some of the remnants of the three houses of men that had fought with the elves against Morgoth. Others were of their kin, who, like the Sylvan elves, had never passed the arid Lewin, and others of remoter kin. But nearly all were descendants of ancient rebels against Morgoth. Some evil men there were also. So when he refers to Western men, he's not necessarily referring to the Númenóreans. The Númenóreans are the Númenóreans, and the Western men are men of the western portion of Middle-earth. That portion of Middle-earth that we're used to thinking of as Middle-earth. So you can see here on the map, I mean, we're really talking about men who inhabited, Eriador, the regions that will later be Rohan, living here in the Vale of Anduin, even as far as the Sea of Rhûn. We might think of the people up here that appear in The Hobbit, up near the Lonely Mountain. So we have lots of men, Western men, who, though not Númenóreans, are still good men, and he did not want the Eastern men, who I guess were very much under the sway of Morgoth in the First Age. He didn't want them to come into contact with these Western men, because I think of what they would be able to see a different way of being that wasn't so tied to Morgothish way of beings. He needed to preserve, these were kind of his reserves, right? He needed these men maybe to build up his, the weapons of his armies, and then he was going to build up armies of orcs, to fight in this war ultimately. Again, that's how I read it. That's kind of me, parsing this and trying to wrap my head around what Tolkien was saying, but always interested in what your all's thoughts are in the comments below. And then finally, we have a passage about orcs of various kinds, which I just thought was kind of an interesting little aside. So I'll go ahead and read some of this. The orcs of various kind, creatures of Morgoth, were to prove the most numerous and terrible of his soldiers and servants, but great hosts of them had been destroyed in the war against Morgoth and in the destruction of Beleriand. Some remnant had escaped to hidings in the northern parts of the Misty Mountains and the Grey Mountains, and were now multiplying again. But further east there were more and stronger kinds, descendants of Morgoth's kingship, but long masterless during his occupation of Orodruin. They were yet wild and ungovernable, preying upon one another and upon men, whether good or evil. But not until Mordor and the Barad-dûr were ready could he allow them to come out of hiding, while the Eastern Orcs, who had not experienced the power and terror of the Eldar or the valor of the Edain, were not subservient to Sauron. While he was obliged for the cozening of Western men and elves to wear as a fair form and countenance as he could, they despised him and laughed at him. Thus it was that though as soon as his disguise was pierced and he was recognized as an enemy, he exerted all his time and strength to gathering and training armies, it took some 90 years before he felt ready to open war. And he misjudged this, as we see in his final defeat, when the great host of Minas Tirith from Númenor landed in Middle-earth. His gathering of armies had not been unopposed, and his success had been much less than his hope. So, just some interesting notes there about the different groups of orcs that exist, just to cover some of the, again, geography of this. So there were orcs in the northern part of the Misty Mountains and the Gray Mountains, the Arid Mithrin up here. And these were, a lot of what was kind of left over of the orcs that fought in these battles and in the battles of Beleriand. But there were also orcs out to the east that were kind of ragtag bands, like weren't really organized under Sauron. So Sauron had to spend some time organizing these armies into armies that could take on the forces of the West. And it takes him 90 years to prepare for that war. Númenor had already been preparing before that, and the elves are going to be preparing for the next, for those next 90 years, now that they know that he is a bad guy. So that's where things stand in the year 1600 with Sauron's creation of the One Ring and the unveiling of his true intentions. So let's look real quick at a couple of the sketches here. Oh. Music cued a little too early there. Turn that off. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties, everybody. Got the early music going on. All right. So, yeah, let's look at some of the images of... let's look at some of the images in this chapter, the two pencil sketches that are in this chapter. First off, we have an image, pretty cool little pencil sketch of Sauron through the image of the forging of his One Ring. Just kind of a nifty little sketch there. Really like that. And then at the end of the chapter, we have a very interesting little detail of two orcs. So one holding a spear and then the other holding a bow and arrow. So not sure which group of orcs this might be assigned to, but nevertheless, a very cool image of two orcs there. All right. So what are the key takeaways from this chapter? What are the key takeaways from this chapter? I'm not really sure I have any, other than the events that transpire themselves. I'll simply offer this. I think the events we learn about in this chapter would have made for several amazing chapters of a much larger work. It pains me to think that we'll never get an epic on the scale of The Lord of the Rings or even the Silmarillion for the major events of the Second Age. I truly believe there might have been several prequel novels to The Lord of the Rings, perhaps the Saga of Númenor, but alas, we'll never have it, at least not as Tolkien would have done it himself. I'll always think to myself, like, in my mind, there may be like 3 actual books, right? Like of the length of Lord of the Rings that could have taken place as prequels to this just from the Second Age alone. And then you think about the Third Age, there's all kinds of stories. So, it'll be interesting to see what the next several years hold. I'll just leave it at this. I mean, my mind can kind of go crazy with the possibilities. But it's sad that we'll never actually hear Tolkien's own take on these stories. In-depth takes. I think just some of the surface level intrigue we see here, it would have been so interesting. It would have been so interesting to be able to peer into Sauron's mind, in a more transparent way to see how he's kind of calculating all these things. Just a really fascinating concept, but alas, it's not to be. Alas, it's not to be. However, there is a next time, and next time we will. The action really picks up as Sauron marches to open war against the elves. As always, keep the correspondence coming. We'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. And don't forget to stop by TrueMythsPress.com for great merch like super stylin' and comfy Tolkien Road t-shirts, 2 Trees camper mugs, and signed copies of my books. Once again, that's TrueMythsPress.com. Thanks for supporting our work with your purchase. And thank you to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R, Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H, Melkor27, KG, Emilio P, Jonathan D, Robert H, Paul D, Julia, Werty, JoeBagelMan, Richard K, Matt R, Matthew W, John W, Eugene D, Chris B, Daniel S, Seb M, Cory C, Carolyn S, Emiel K, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T, Redhawk, Shannon S, Brian O, Zeke F, James L, Chris L, Asya V, Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C, David of Pints with Jack, Eric B, and Alaskan Moose 31. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching and or listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.